Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Anderson. I'm Associate Superintendent for Spokane Schools, and I'll be serving as the host tonight for our boundary forum that we're holding across the city. This is our third of four forums, and we're focusing on the south side of the district and some of the recommended changes that our boundary committee has been working on. And I'm joined this evening with a group of members of our boundary adjustment committee that's been working for about a year now on developing a draft that you're going to hear tonight. We have more work to do, and then tonight we're wanting to hear feedback from you and have you have a good understanding of what the current draft is. So with that, I'm going to introduce my fellow panelists on the call tonight. Teresa Meyer is assistant principal at Lewis and Clark High School. Beth Nye is principal at Adams. Megan is a parent on the south side of the district. Sandra Gerard is our communications director. Ryan Rowe is doing a lot of our technical work. He's our supervisor of fiscal and student data information. Kathleen is a parent on the south side of the district. Sean Jordan is our executive director of secondary schools. Craig Namata is our director of budget and also has been working in the whole demographic information to assist us. Greg Forsythe is our director of capital projects. Greg oversees all of our school construction programs. Kate is a parent on the south side of the district. And then finally, we have Hariam Martin Morris. Hariam is a former Seattle School Board member and current board member on the State Board of Education and has been working with us now, I think, for 3 years as a consultant on grade configurations and boundaries. And then finally, my colleague, Phil Crocker. Phil, too, has been with us for about 3 years now, assisting us through all of these different studies that we've been doing along the way. So we have a presentation tonight that will last about an hour, and then that will be followed by a question and answer time amongst the panelists, answering questions that you asked in that question and answer feature. And then we'll get to everybody's question, though, eventually, either through emailing you back or talking about it tonight. So with that, I'm going to call up the presentation and we will get started with some of the housekeeping portions here to start. So as I mentioned, this is the third of four forums that we are having on draft budget boundary changes. And we'll do this presentation tonight, and then you'll notice there's a question and answer feature in the Zoom that you can, as the presentation is going along, ask questions or give comments. Or if you'd prefer, you can email afterwards, after hearing the presentation, to boundaries@sps81.org, and we are getting all of those questions and responding to them eventually. So at the end of the presentation, Phil is going to act as our moderator and have some of the common questions posed to our panelists to get answers. And then what I would encourage everyone to go to the district's website at spokaneschools.org/boundary change. We have a really good frequently asked question that our communications department has developed, and we keep adding to it. So as we get more common questions, we're adding to that question and answer. So that's a good spot to get more information if you'd like to. With that, why are we doing these forums? They are for our boundary committee that's been working now, and I'll show you the names. A very large committee has been working for about a year, and it's to get feedback on this current draft. We've had lots of different iterations, but we have this draft that we think answers quite a few of the needs of the district, and wanted your comments on that. So the topics tonight are, why are we adjusting school boundaries? Why are we doing this? What's the process? What's the timeline? When will they get changed? Who's on the committee? What's been some of the guidelines and influencers that the committee has been using to adjust the boundary lines? What's the impact on students and families? We do have a new board policy called legacy status, and I'll explain that. It's a way of allowing students to finish certain grades in their schools if the boundaries change. As you know, we have a very rigorous and well-developed choice program, option programs, special programs. We'll talk about those three. We'll show you the maps on the south side of the district and talk about cohort information. Those are the topics here in the presentation. So why are we changing boundaries? Well, it's really for good educational reasons. And the first, probably most prominent one, is to have enough capacity at schools so we can reduce class size for our youngest learners in grades kindergarten through third grade. Legislation passed back in 2015 to provide the funding to hire enough teachers to have class sizes around between 18 and 20 students per class. But we didn't have enough classrooms in the district to physically be able to do that. We estimated at the time that it would probably take 6 more elementary schools to be able to get to that enough space in schools. Or if we move 6th graders up into a middle school, then 3 new middle schools. And as you know, we're in the process of building 3 new middle schools. That's what the board decided to do. The second reason is we are growing and anticipate growing more in Spokane schools. If you've been reading the newspaper, you'll hear that Spokane is the hottest housing market on the West Coast. And we have people moving here and young families. And so we need to create capacity in our schools so that neighborhoods, kids can go to their neighborhood schools. So that's a second big reason for changing boundaries. And as I mentioned, we've got the new middle school configuration of grades 6, 7, 8 that we're building 3 new middle schools in order to have enough room to move all the 6th graders up. And then also balancing the size of schools and capacity that they have. You know, we have not changed boundaries for over 40 years. And the demographics of where people live in Spokane schools with kids has changed. So we have some schools that are way oversubscribed. They don't have room for their neighborhood kids, and they don't have room for their classrooms. They have art, you know, on a cart. They have music in the gym, etc. So trying to get capacity at all of our schools and balance them out. We have other schools that are way under capacity. So that's one secondary reason for doing these boundary changes. Then the other is to try to keep cohorts of neighborhoods and schools together if possible through their K through 12 experience. Not always possible, but that's kind of a secondary goal. With that, as I mentioned, we started this work back in 2015 when the legislation was developed to lower class size. And then we did a study that actually Hariam and Phil assisted us on do we have the right grade configurations in Spokane to meet the needs? Currently, you know, we're kindergarten through 6th grade elementary, 7, 8 middle school, and 9 through 12 high school. The result of that study was the board decided to move to a 6, 7, 8 middle school model. And that's what was on the 2018 bond that Spokane voters overwhelmingly approved. And now we're in the process of designing and building those 3 new middle schools, one on the northeast side of the district, one on the northwest, and one up on the South Hill. After we passed the bond, we had a committee, not this committee, but a different committee. Some members have been on both committees, develop guidelines for when we actually do draw the lines. What guidelines should the committee follow? And Hariam's going to talk about those. The board adopted them in June of 2019. Then we started the current committee's work and have been working since about February of 20 up through this year. So about a year and a couple of months. The plan is to have the board adopt the changes in June of this year, but they won't go into effect for the South Hill for 2 years from now. So at least we can start getting to know where we're going to go. The new South middle school staff and principal can get to know their feeder pattern and that sort of thing. So the purpose of this committee was to use those guidelines and then actually model out some different ways of handling it for lower class size and student growth. Several folks that I've introduced to you are facilitators, but we have parents from the Northeast and the Northwest. We have Southeast and Southwest parents. We have a Spokane Education Associated rep, and then both Beth and Teresa are a couple of our administrators who've been serving, but we have quite a few, and central office staff. Two of our board members have been serving on the boundary committee as well. So the boundary committee work, our timeline is we started work last January. We've been exploring options for about a year. Now we have a draft proposal to share with you tonight. And then that's where we want your feedback here in April. We're going to go back to work in May to refine the boundary guidelines or boundary adjustments, and then present those to the board in June. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hariam to talk about the guidelines the previous committee developed that the board approved, what they mean, and how they've helped the committee in actually making this draft.
Thank you, Mark. So one of the things that we have to make sure we talk about is the guidelines were board approved last year. The key thing is that they're not in any particular order. And that was intentional because they all are interrelated. And in fact, some of them are in conflict with each other. We can look at diversity in neighborhoods and say, well, if your neighborhood's not diverse, can the school be diverse? And so that's the tension that the committee worked with a lot. For this presentation, we're looking in terms of, when we talk about cohorts, we're talking about collections of students, but not necessarily in a broad geographical area. So they're clusters of students. And so that's when we talk about, so it may be a 30 block area. That cluster of students might be a cohort that's going and attending a particular school. The research that we've done around the cohort is pretty clear that we want to keep students that live near each other together. That's really important. And I know a lot of people have asked that, well, where's that research? If you're interested in that, I'd be happy to share some of the research that we've used to help us inform ourselves about what is best for kids as we move through this. That is why we are really striving in this draft to keep students together K-12 whenever possible, because that's kind of the holy grail of when you do boundary work. And the fact that a school district of this size in Spokane has, for a large degree, kept a lot of students together K-12. And so kudos to the city, kudos to the committee for making that that choice in the boundary work. And then the last thing, the last two things, school quality and transportation. Spokane is using the KPIs, the key performance indicators. And those are the things that we use to look at in a holistic way, not just test scores, around how the school is doing for kids. And lastly, the other guardrail that we put up was, whatever we do, we want to not increase the transportation costs that we incur as we go through and do this work. Mark?
That was followed then by the committee working, this particular committee, having some things that are influencing our draft boundaries. And I'll let Phil talk about some of those influencers that we've been kind of keeping in mind.
There we go, unmute. Thank you, Mark. So the committee did, as they did their work, they started, as Harry mentioned, with the guardrails of the board adopted guidelines, and realized quickly that they kind of needed some other influencers, if you will. Some items emerged that the committee coalesced around, and that helped lead the work to where it is today and the maps you'll see today. Anticipated areas of growth, we've done a lot of work, and the committee's heard a lot of feedback on where developments are occurring, where growth is occurring. The school district has built a great relationship with the city planning department now. Over the years that we've been here, we've seen it grow, and they're getting greater and greater lead times. Those areas of growth, challengingly, tend to be on the edges of the district, on the east and west sides. That's where there's space for those developments. It's also where we don't have a ton of schools. So you'll see tonight, we'll talk about a little bit of what the committee's had to go through to try to meet those challenges. We talked about maintaining cohorts to limit impacts on transitions. Again, that is the research. It's pretty clear that the students most impacted by transitions between schools, from elementary to middle to high, are those students most in need, those students who need the most support. So by keeping peer groups together, keeping communities together of parents and kids, and even creating this ability for a known vertical alignment with between schools, it can really help student outcomes across the district. Balancing school sizes, Mark talked about that. That was a key piece, and one of the primary drivers. We need to get schools right-sized. The nice thing on that is it's going to create more opportunity for some of the portfolio schools model that Spokane has around choice. Some schools today are significantly oversubscribed, and by rebalancing, it will equalize sort of the opportunities for choice across different schools, especially at the high school level. We'll talk about that later. Sixth grade impact, by moving sixth graders in, we'll have a little slide on that later. We have to move some kids out of those schools to make that room. So that's why the new middle schools are being built, and why people are realizing that the feeder patterns are needing to change. Largely because the middle schools have different capacity now. We did look at, as a committee, we did look at family access to school. Again, because our schools are not necessarily where we would love to place them relative to where students live, they are where we have the ability to put schools and where they've been historically. We did look at what are the public transportation options, what are the transportation corridors to move families and buses efficiently between schools. So that was some work that the committee did through the map iterations. And then we did talk about the neighborhood cohorts. When you keep neighborhoods of kids together through elementary, middle, and high, then you will have cohorts that line up with the socioeconomics of those neighborhoods. And the committee spent a lot of time with this and a lot of conversations around equity and balance, and it is just a truism of boundary adjustments work that in a large city, neighborhood cohort models are going to be in tension with some diversity and free reduced lunch numbers, because very few neighborhoods are equally balanced in that manner. So that's the committee, and we have panelists who can speak to that because they've spent many hours talking through it amongst themselves. This is an example of just an example of some of the data that the committee saw as each map iteration came through, and they would send us away to do some work and come back with new iterations of an area of the city or a portion of the city or a layer. We would also bring back a series of data, and this is the free and reduced lunch data for middle schools. And you can see we have little arrows there. You can read it kind of vertically. Base would be basically the current planning data. Now, the planning data represents the students in the drawn attendance zone. It's not the actual number of students in that school, because some kids choice in, some kids choice out, some kids might go to a special program or an option school. But for planning purposes, for example, if you look to the first column there on the left, Glover, you'll see that currently in the plan data it would be 75%. And in the new model, revised model, it would be just under 67%. So that's the kind of data that the committee saw. And we did see it beyond free and reduced lunch. We looked at enrollment, special education data, English language development data, and racial diversity for each school at each level, elementary, middle, and high. We've compiled, I think it's about 14-page report with keys and everything, showing you this data for all levels and all schools. And we will get it up on the district website here shortly. I think it's just being prepared to be up, so you can take a look at that yourself if you like. One thing that the committee early on, about almost 18 months ago, asked was, can we come at this and can we try to use boundary adjustments to do some equalization on free and reduced lunch numbers. And for those of you that don't know, free and reduced lunch is sort of a proxy for socioeconomic status within the school systems. And basically trying to get at socioeconomic diversity. Can we blend our schools a little bit better? And it's really difficult in a city like Spokane, in most cities, again, because areas of the city tend to be less diverse on either end. And so Craig, I'll have Craig talk to this real briefly, but Craig and his team went out and devised a model that would equalize that. Craig, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. What we did is we took a look at where the 6 current middle schools and the 3 new middle schools are located, and tried to draw boundaries that would balance the enrollment to the capacity of the schools, and also try to get a relatively mixed, relatively balanced number of free and reduced price lunch versus non-free and reduced price lunch students in each school. In this particular map, the blue represents the non-free and reduced price lunch, and the yellow represents the free and reduced lunch. Based on the way that the Spokane School District is, the way that the neighborhoods are, in order to get that balance across all 9 schools, we really had to kind of draw vertical lines and quickly dismiss this as a viable option with the amount of transportation, with one of the aims of trying to keep students as best we could to kind of their nearest 1 or 2 or 3 middle schools, which we've got more pictures later in the presentation.
Thank you, Craig. And we show this only because the question does arise, did the committee look at trying to balance free and reduced lunch? And the committee did look at it and realized that to do it holistically across the district would create a nightmare for families and students and transportation, and no one would go to schools with their peers. But what they did then is said, okay, but locally, as we look at other adjustments, let's keep that in mind, as that's why it's one of the influencers in a sense. And then another question that has come up often, and it's a very good one, is why can't I live near a school, yet the new assignment plan has me going to a completely different school? Why can't I just go to my closest school? Why can't kids just all go to their nearest closest school? And Craig, maybe you could walk us through these middle and high school maps that explain that.
Sure. On the middle school map, we drew a circle of a 1.25 mile radius around each school, which we picked that number because it gets us closest to the current capacities of each school, which is in the range of 750 to 800 students. And what we found when we were drawing these circles around each school is that many of the circles, particularly in the Northwest and the Northeast, those circles overlapped. So we would end up with, in this particular map, we're looking at about 6,000 middle school students. And on the left, 4,000 students would have a location inside one of those 1.25 mile radiuses. Several students have more than one school, and even some have up to 3 schools to choose from as being their closest middle school. The picture on the right shows all the kids that are outside of that range, and it's about 2,000 students that live further away than at least 1.25 miles as the crow flies from any middle school.
Thanks, Craig. And we have a similar example for high schools here.
So for high school, we increased the size of the circle to about 2 miles to reach approximately 1,500 students, which is kind of about the average size for the 8,000 or so high school students that we have, and our 5 high schools. And there's a pocket in there of kids that are within a 2 mile radius of 4 high schools, kind of in central Spokane. And there still are almost 2,000 students that don't live within 2 miles of any school.
So the short answer is, if we just let kids go to their nearest school, about a third of our middle schoolers would not have a priority school that they could be assigned to, and about a quarter of our high schoolers would not have a neighborhood school they could be, or a nearby proximity school they could be assigned to. And it's that work that the committee had to struggle with to start. If we look down by Ferris High School in the lower right-hand corner of the right-hand map, you'll see a number of students, hundreds of students, if not maybe even 1,000 or so, up above Ferris High School. Those students need to come into a high school. And as soon as we move those students into a high school, if you look at the left-hand map, you'll see that we have to displace students from Ferris High School if we're going to pull those in, because it's already filled with those students. And that is exactly the work the committee was working on, trying to figure out how do we take numbers of students around the city and bring them into, and once we bring them in, now we have too many students in the middle, so where do they go? And that's the work of boundary adjustments. The cohort model, by assigning middle schools to high schools and elementary schools to middle schools, allowed them to keep families and kids together with their peers as they move through it. And then they could use those options of, okay, which elementary schools would make up which middle schools, which would make up high schools. And that's how that worked. We got at that work. I think a lot of people wonder sort of how is the pie baked, basically along those lines. Nearly about 10 months ago, before the committee took a short break for summer, they had gone through all of the district, and they had gone through it at all three levels, elementary, middle, and high, and built those sort of emerging feeder patterns. And when they left, they felt pretty good about the work and had struggled with a lot of those pieces, and they put it aside and let it sort of gestate for a few weeks. And in that model, there were 14 elementary schools across the city that were split going into middle school. And we felt pretty good about that. Again, for a city the size of Spokane, that's a pretty phenomenal leap. But when we came back from summer, well, actually, we'll show you the next slide. This is the map view of the sort of the breakout. And this is what it looks like in a table form. And you can see that, for example, on that first line, if you go down from the top, Linwood, well, actually, I'll go down and use a school in the south. If we look at Moran Prairie, if you go down the left-hand side, you'll see that Moran Prairie in this model would be split 86 students to Chase, and 168 would go on to the New South Middle School, and so on. So those were the 14 schools. And then even more frustrating was after these kids were split between elementary and middle, when we look at the inset map, which is middle to high school, you see that kids are split again from their middle schools going to high school in that model. And again, if we look at the New South Middle School, the first line there, you would see that about 2/3 of the kids would go to Ferris and about 1/3 would go to LC. And the committee came back from their short break, and this didn't sit great. And we had heard from families that these splits were hard on the kids as they continue to split from their peer groups. So they went back to work, and that is what led us to the cohort model. And on this next slide, and the cohort model, there's an opportunity to have 0 elementary school split going into middle school. The current proposal that has been out for community feedback has 4 elementary schools split. We'll talk about that in more detail. And there was some back and forth, and this is why we're having the community meetings, is the committee really wants feedback on how folks feel about that and how that work looks for them. There is one middle school that splits to high school in all models, and that's because of an imbalance in the number of middle schools to high schools. And it is in the South where 3 middle schools need to roll up to 2 high schools. So 1 middle school will necessarily need to be split. But we have models right now where 4 elementary schools are split. It could be as low as 0 in other models. And the committee's open to feedback too about if the community feels that more elementary schools should be split. They're open to that feedback. Ryan, maybe you could walk us through the estimated impact of the proposed boundary changes.
Sure. So the committee was very careful to try and limit the impact of elementary school movements. So the elementary school movements have been limited to 8% of the total elementary population. And the reason the committee was really intentional about that was because we realized that, you know, a disruption after the current year was to be avoided if possible. The 8% of students that were moved were generally moved to resolve oversubscription at schools, to take advantage of capital projects that had recently been completed, or to account for imminent residential development. Outside of those areas, we really try to limit movements for elementary students. At middle school, the percentage is 42%. So obviously a lot more, and that is because we were adding 3 new middle schools. And so we had to move the 6th graders in the population, which required larger adjustments. The cohort model contributed to that a bit also, but the minimum movement there was going to be 33% regardless. At the high school level, that really has to do with on the north side, we were trying to see if we could fit 2 full cohorts into to each high school to sort of maintain those consistent feeder patterns, or just general movements that we made that better matched where our students were with where our high schools are located. And then 30% of students had a revision to their feeder pattern at some point in the process. What this slide shows is we have a lot of families asking, so why did my middle school boundaries change? And so that we had originally, and just taking a generic school, we had about 400 7th graders and 400 8th graders attending each of our middle schools. To make room for the 6th graders, and we had to move out 270 7th and 8th graders to make room for a new 276 graders. So the boundaries of our middle schools are shrinking because we are now have 3 grades in each middle school rather than 2. And this one will show, so we were really looking to see if we could keep cohorts together to the extent possible. 99% of elementary students will stay with their neighborhood cohort all the way through for their entire SPS career. On the South Hill, we did end up splitting cohorts from Moran Prairie, Adams, Hutton, and Wilson. We did look at a cohort option for the South Hill in particular. And that would have been sort of a north-south cohort feeder pattern that would have fed Grant and Franklin into the New South, along with Hamlin and Mullen Road. The challenge there that the committee was wrestling with was transporting students from near the freeway up to 65th when we have incomplete transportation lines going all the way up to that area of the South Hill. And so that was the reason that the committee chose the current proposal over the cohort model.
So the board did just adopt a new policy that will assist in lessening the impacts of transitions when we actually change the boundaries. So the boundary changes will go into effect on the north side of the district in the 22-23 school year. So still a year away. That'll allow time for the principals and staff at the new Northwest and Northeast middle schools to know their neighborhoods, start orienting parents and kids to coming to their schools. And then the boundary changes will be a year later, so 23-24 for the south side of the district, so 2 years from now. But when the boundary changes go into effect, if you started, for example, as a 9th grader at Lewis and Clark High School, and the boundaries for your high school changed to Ferris, you could stay at Lewis and Clark High School clear through the rest of your high school career if you so chose this legacy status. Same thing if you were a 7th grader at Sacagawea Middle School and the boundaries changed so that you would be going to the new South middle schools. If you chose to, you could finish at SAC as an 8th grader, as a legacy status student, and be provided transportation to SAC. Finally, an example, elementary, if you started as the boundaries changed, you were going into 5th grade at Hutton Elementary, and the boundaries changed so that you'd be going to a different school, you could stay and finish your elementary career as a 5th grader at Hutton when the 6th graders moved up into the new middle schools. The second part of the legacy status is, if you are not a 5th grader, not a 9th grader, not an incoming 8th grader, but the boundary change, you're a 2nd grader at, let's say, Hutton, and you prefer to stay at Hutton versus going to the school that's your new school boundary, you have first choice with legacy status of choicing back into the school and staying there through your elementary career above any other new choice student. As you know, we have quite a large choice program in Spokane schools. Lots of folks choice to different schools, and the information we're sharing with you tonight and the data we're sharing with you, like free and reduced lunch, it's based on strictly, a model of who lives in that neighborhood. In reality, we have many families choice their students to different neighborhood schools or option programs, those sorts of things. So keep that in mind. We're just trying to model neighborhoods. With that, the choice program will continue. We're planning to, once you choice into a school, you can stay. And as I mentioned, priority consideration will be given to students who want to choice back to the school they've been going when the boundary changes. The boundaries really won't affect our option programs like the Spokane Public Montessori or the Institute for Science and Technology at North Central High School or the community school. Those are district-wide programs, not influenced by neighborhood boundaries. So those will continue and not be impacted by any boundary changes. And as well as our special education programs. They're placed in certain schools, and those programs will stay in those schools, and we provide transportation for those students. With that, we'll show you a chart, and then we're going to show you some maps, but I'll turn it back to Phil or Ryan to explain these charts.
Sure, thanks, Mark. Ryan put together a table here for folks to be able to find their elementary school down the left-hand side, and then kind of get a sense of, did the boundaries change? Are students moving in or out? And what would be the middle school cohort and the high school? Maybe if we could slide down to the South Hill, which would be the next couple. There we go, one more. And Ryan, do you want to walk through and just sort of explain this and highlight any areas?
Sure. What we tried to put together for families and schools was a table that would quickly allow you to sort of determine how the boundary changes impact your school specifically. So it starts out with the elementary school on the left, and what it's telling you is, if it says yes, was there any adjustment at all made to my boundaries? It'll say yes there, and no if no changes were made. If the answer is yes, it'll also inform you if there was movements in or out, or both in and out. And so we had several adjustments to South Hill schools, as you can see. And then going over to the right, it'll tell you what your middle school feeder pattern is, and if it's complete for your specific elementary school all the way through to high school. And then the far right column will tell you approximately what the split is for your elementary school. So as we mentioned previously, Moran Prairie, Adams, Hutton, and Wilson all have splits in our current proposal. And so those are the ratios on the far right.
Thank you, Ryan. We're doing well on time. We have about, we want to make sure we have lots of time to answer some questions. And I see that just about half have been answered so far in the Q&A, if you want to check that, if you haven't been watching it. And we will try to get to the others at the end. Let me go ahead and share the maps. I'm going to ask Craig to walk through we have some high detail maps here. We can zoom in a little bit, and Craig will walk us through the south part of the city and the boundaries, and then kind of highlight some areas where the committee made changes or struggled with changes and is looking for community feedback on those changes specifically. And I would say most of South Hill probably falls into that category. because there's some complexities there with geography, transportation, and just enrollment. So Craig, why don't we start at the elementary level? Oh, and Craig, could you please let us know as we look at things, what color, I know it's small print, what schools are what color as we talk about them?
Sure. And thanks for talking just a little bit extra long so I could get a drink.
Sure.
All right. So if we start on the west, the purple area further west. Other way.
Oh, sorry.
Yep. Purple. So the purple area and the gray area, those are currently, and at the purple area up to the Spokane River, the purple area and the gray area are currently Hutton, and then there's a small slice at the bottom of the gray that is actually currently Wilson, a small slice at the bottom. Those areas, the purple has been proposed to be sent to move north to Finch Elementary, and the current gray is proposed to remain at Hutton, other than this the small area that's at the bottom of the gray that is currently Wilson. Those would be proposed to move to Hutton. The reason that we started with the reason I'm starting there is that we had lots of discussion about these particular areas. Hutton is one of our schools that currently, by enrollment in the school and the number of classrooms available, is using every available space they can for classrooms. And nearly all of their classrooms are at the top of, they're above average enrollment across all grade levels. What we were hoping to be able to do through boundary adjustment and moving sixth graders to middle school is get all of our schools such that they could recapture some of their auxiliary space to be able to offer, as Mark was saying before, to be able to offer art in an art classroom, to be able to offer science in a science classroom, to have dedicated music space so that kids, and dedicated special education space so that students can have, I guess, maximized educational experience based on the size of the facility. As we looked at Wilson Elementary, one of the reasons that we suggested moving that small area was that the projection of Wilson enrollment in the current boundary was that it was going to be also overfull, just barely. As we were looking at the West Hills area and the River Run, Palisades, Arboretum, Grandview areas, there wasn't a way to split the numbers to be able to get all the enrollment to be able to stay at Hutton. So we kind of divided it where it looked like geographically there might be a reasonable place to split it. As we scroll further east, one of the next areas that we moved, the pink area that is currently Hamblin Elementary, there's a small little section on the lower southeast side that is currently a Mullen Road area. It's in the Mullen Road boundary, and it is being proposed to move into the Hamlin boundary. Along 55th Avenue, there are 3 large apartment complexes that currently all feed into Mullen Road, and moving one of them alleviates some of the overcrowding that is in Mullen Road. And based on our projections of where what enrollment will look like as choice gets reset and as the sixth graders move out, Hamlin would have the capacity to absorb that couple of blocks and that apartment complex. The right where you are, the gray area that's currently Adams, it gets a little bit smaller as we consider. They actually right now they're about okay with their current enrollment. What's not reflected in their current enrollment though is the incredible amount of students choicing out of that school. And if all students that are in the Adams attendance area attended Adams, they would need several more classrooms to be able to fit their students in that school. So we have adjusted some of their boundaries to take advantage of where the capacity exists and create a little more space in Adams. Most of that enrollment adjustment happened to move some Adams boundaries into the Moran Prairie neighborhood. And then a little further north, the other change that is proposed, kind of other, I guess, triangle of changes that are proposed involve Franklin, Sheridan, so Franklin in brown, Sheridan in gray, and Lincoln Heights in yellow. And those are largely to take advantage of the current capacity that's at Franklin. Franklin was just remodeled recently to be quite a bit larger than it currently was, than it previously was. And so they have additional classroom capacity to be able to take on additional enrollment. As what frequently happens in a school district, that we can't move the buildings, the projected growth wasn't going to happen inside of the Franklin attendance area where the school had increased capacity. It looks like the large part of enrollment growth is going to happen along Carnahan inside the Lincoln Heights attendance area. There's currently one apartment complex that is quite large that is nearly, occupancy has started and it's nearly complete. And then there are about 600 more apartment units that are being proposed in the same general neighborhood. So we have proposed, the committee proposed getting Sheridan and Lincoln Heights ready to absorb that anticipated additional enrollment by increasing Franklin's boundary to take up some of what are currently Sheridan and Lincoln Heights boundaries, to be able to allow Sheridan and Lincoln Heights to absorb the projected enrollment. So I think those are the major changes, unless I missed anything. If anyone else wants to jump in.
You know, Craig, I would only say, because I think some folks might question the Apple K-8 program, the Apple program right now is K-5 and it is at Franklin. And the space needed at Franklin to absorb the capacity for these adjustments to allow the schools the right size is actually probably going to challenge that program if it tries to move to K-8. So again, the district had to make some difficult decisions, but needed the space at Franklin for neighborhood kids as the boundaries were being adjusted and as growth was occurring. I should clarify that I don't think that program is going anywhere. I think that's just was a tension spot. Why don't we look at middle school maps? So you want to start on the west again, Craig?
Yeah, maybe zoom out all the way and we can. And are you on? So I guess the larger concept with what we were looking at, on the north side, we have 6 middle schools and 3 high schools. On the south side, we have 3 middle schools and 2 high schools. On the south side, we also have 12 elementaries feeding into those 3 middle schools. So we started with looking at, well, will it work to have 4 elementaries feeding into each of the middle schools? As we were looking through what our choices were and recognizing that we've traditionally only had 2 middle schools, and they've been consistent feeder patterns into Sac and into Chase. With the addition of the new South Middle School, we had to figure out what schools, what feeder pattern would be the best match to feed into the new South Middle School. Mullen Road Elementary was kind of the obvious one, since the new South Middle School is inside and right next to Mullen Road Elementary. Hamblin was also a fairly clear choice, as it is contiguous to Mullen Road and very close. The next 3 elementaries to choose from to be able to fit approximately 4 elementaries into the new South Middle School are Jefferson, Adams, and Moran Prairie. Looking at Jefferson and Adams, they present some challenge in that Sacagawea is currently inside the Jefferson attendance area, and Chase is currently inside the current Adams attendance area. So they didn't seem on the surface to be great candidates to choose a full elementary feeding into the new middle school when one of the current middle schools is already inside their attendance zone. In the Q&A, I've seen lots of questions asking about what was the consistent all elementaries feeding directly into middle schools with no splits. And I'm going to speak to that one first before we get to kind of where so far we've landed. Trying to avoid looking at using Jefferson and Adams, the proposal was to include Franklin and Grant. And if you could, Phil, zoom out just a little bit. And as we looked at those 4 elementaries, Grant, Franklin, Hamblin, and Mullen Road, and then using Roosevelt, Hutton, Wilson, and Jefferson at Sacagawea, and then Sheridan, Lincoln Heights, Adams, and Moran Prairie at Chase, we actually got a pretty good balance of enrollment and a pretty good balance of socioeconomic measurement across those 3 middle schools. It very quickly, the conversation amongst the committee reached equity and access to a school, suggesting that the students at Grant and Franklin that are all the way down by the freeway having to get all the way up to 65th seemed like a pretty substantial reach to make that happen. We looked at where the current bus lines were, not just the yellow bus, but also STA, and how long it would take for families to get there, recognizing that there are on the lower South Hill transportation challenges and students and families that don't have access to vehicles, what it would take for them to access to be able to reach the new South Middle School. And it seemed fairly burdensome based on the existing STA routes. We have had over many years across other spots in the district questions where we tried to move a bus stop, an STA bus stop, to be more convenient to some of our schools, and it is a really long process to be able to make that work. They do their own analysis on what's efficient, how many buses they can run, what usage looks like. So we couldn't really, it didn't seem like a viable option to propose it without a timeline for if and when or how long it might take to look at whether or not an STA bus line would be a viable option to serve the new South Middle School. So that's really a description of what the cohort, direct cohort to middle school model looked like as we were reviewing the South Hill. Where we ended up landing was trying to figure out how do we get approximately 4 elementaries worth into the new South Middle School. And again, Mullen Road and Hamlin were the fairly easy choices. As we were looking, we'll start on the southeast, either Adams or Moran Prairie is a fairly viable option to put one school into the New South and one school into Chase. As we were looking, the concern that we came up with, as we were as I was saying before, our free and reduced price lunch balance in the cohort model was fairly even. If we kept Adams fully at Chase and moved Moran Prairie fully to the new South Middle School, the Chase free and reduced lunch went up substantially, and the new South Middle School would be one of our lowest I've lost the word. One of our most highly economic schools in the district. And so, and because because Moran Prairie is such a large geographic area, there also are their borders are close in proximity to both Chase Middle School and the New South. That there are some students that are much closer to the New South and some that are much closer to the New Chase. So we tried to draw kind of an initial split that would better balance the free and reduced price lunch mix across the two middle schools, and take into account the proximity of where our students live in relation to where those two middle schools are. Those two schools alone, the mix of those wasn't quite going to be enough to fill the new South Middle School, and also the current Sacagawea boundary, as we added 6th graders to the mix, was going to put Sacagawea over its projected facility capacity. So we were looking for approximately in the range of 90 to 100 additional students that needed to be moved out of the proposed Sacagawea boundary and into the new South Middle School. The two proposals, or the two, I guess really 3 options we were looking at to move approximately that number of students inside the Jefferson boundary, directly, if you want to zoom into Jefferson a little bit there, Phil, directly east of Grand Boulevard in the Jefferson boundary, there are about 100 middle school, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade middle school students. So we could have drawn a boundary there. Drawing a different line at 37th, there are approximately 100 students that live south of 37th that we could have drawn that line to move those students to New South instead. We ultimately landed on the area on up the 195 corridor that is currently from elementary. Those are Wilson and Hutton students. And we were looking at transportation and distance and time, and we're noting that those students are on buses anyway, because there are no nearby elementaries or middle schools. And going up 195 to and up Hatch to approach new middle school, the new South Middle School, it was only a time difference of about 2 minutes from the time that it takes to access to get to Sacagawea and the time that it would take to get to the new South Middle School. It also, as we are watching projected potential enrollment growth or housing growth on the 195 corridor, we may have an opportunity to build a new elementary school several years down the road. And those populations likely would, or those regions likely would feed the new elementary school and then would be kept intact to go to the new South Middle School. So that was a bit of projection planning to try to look at not moving that one multiple times.
And Craig, thank you, Craig. And I'm going to move us to the high school so that we have some time for the Q&A. Can you talk just briefly about, I think the roll-ups to the high school are a little bit more straightforward than the complexity of the middle schools.
Yeah, so the roll-ups to the high school, we tried to stick to some pattern of cohort, and where we landed, the current proposal has every elementary feeding back into one high school. So even though some of the cohorts, the Wilson, Jefferson, and Adams and Moran Prairie students are split into middle school, they would return with their same elementary cohorts to their high school. So Wilson and Jefferson all go back. As they're elementary, they get split into middle school, but then they come back together for high school. And same for Adams and Moran Prairie.
I think you meant Wilson and Hutton, not Wilson.
Oh, Wilson and Hutton, sorry. Yep.
Oh, that's okay, correct. And the blue here is the LC proposed boundaries, and the gray would be the Ferris boundaries.
Right.
And
overall, as we were looking at high schools, if you want to zoom out just a little bit, I think it's important to recognize what we were overall attempting to do in our current enrollment boundaries. Shadle is our smallest high school by geography, and LC is our largest high school also by geography, such that there's about a 600 student disparity between Shadle and LC. Shadle being just under 1,200 students and LC being about 1,800. And the opportunity to redraw boundaries to get better balance between the schools was an attempt to get similar enrollment numbers, which also allows for similar programming numbers as we talk about things like having enough students to be able to offer multiple foreign languages all the way through 4 years, to offer comprehensive music programs and many other things. That having a smaller enrollment high school versus a larger one creates some logistical disparity.
One benefit of rebalancing the enrollment across the district is that, especially at the high school level, there should be ample space for students to choice. And because of the transportation options with STA, a more equitable option for kids to choice into a school if they specifically want a program. And I think we think there'll be a couple hundred seats, correct, Ryan, at each of the high schools available, give or take, again, because these are planning numbers, not actual numbers, but there should be ample opportunity at the high school for students to choice into almost any high school. Is that correct?
Yes, the current boundary maps do a much better job of balancing out our high school population at all the schools.
Okay. Well, thank you, Craig. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the maps there. And we can go on to the Q&A portion right now. And I've been trying to keep an eye on, it looks like we've answered almost 2/3 of the questions. That is great. So if you want to scan the answered questions, you will see that. And then again, we will get to any questions that we'll email folks if we don't get to their question here, but we do have some that kind of fall into categories. So one of the areas we're seeing some questions on is questions about school quality. there's some, one of the pieces, one of the the guidelines was that every school would be a quality school that students get to attend, that your address wouldn't define whether you got a quality school or not. And if you had to shift, that you might go to a different school, but it wouldn't be a quality difference. And we have Beth, principal of Adams, with us, Beth Nye, and maybe Beth, you could take that and talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely, Phil, thanks. So I guess I would just go back to that, which is Spokane Public Schools really strives to make sure that all of our schools are a quality school. And we have a lot of consistency throughout our school district regarding obviously the effort to make sure that every classroom is staffed with a high quality teacher. We have a very robust training offerings here in Spokane Public Schools to follow up with professional development options for that staff. We have a very consistent curriculum that's offered throughout our schools. Yes, there are some various variations at some schools, but we have a very common opportunity for teachers to access that curriculum to support student learning. We do offer quite a few different opportunities for extracurriculars, some common things throughout our schools as well. So all of those things wrapped together create that quality school, and at the same time acknowledging that every school is unique and has its own culture, and that we have those that flexibility to develop our own school community and culture that's unique to that site. But overall, those foundational aspects of the school, high quality staff, high quality curriculum, those are consistent among our schools and helps lend towards that quality school at every school, no matter which school your child will be attending.
Thank you, Beth. And one piece, as we go through the public feedback sessions with the forums and receive emails, we are making adjustments and putting data out for families to see. And so we anticipate having more data on the FAQ and website about each school, actually, because many people have perceptions about schools, but they don't know what's actually happening. We've heard that, oh, that school doesn't offer AP programs. That school absolutely offers a wide range of AP programs. So we're getting that data out onto the websites for folks. And additionally, there's questions around equity on financial equity. Are some schools getting the resources they need if they have different struggles than other schools? And we're looking to get that data out there for you also. So you can put it up, and so keep checking back to that SPS boundary page with the frequently asked questions. That's where we'll post that information. Ryan, you had seen quite a few questions on choice come through. Could you take a second and just sort of address some of those en masse that you saw, some themes you saw on choice?
Sure. A lot of the question is, what types of data do we use, and how was did choice impact the determination if a school is considered oversubscribed? And for the purposes of the Boundary Committee, we took all students enrolled in a current boundary, so whether they were attending that school or whether or not they were choice students, and we used those to calculate the number of potential students in that boundary. And so with the understanding that after movements that choice options would change. And so those were really the pertinent numbers for us to use for that determination. And so it's just important for families to understand, if you are in one of those 8% of schools that is considered oversubscribed, that it's not choice in students that is resulting from and your child being in a school that's considered oversubscribed and maybe your boundaries being adjusted. We were really focusing on what the population density around those schools is, and we were trying to make neighborhood boundaries with those considerations in mind.
Thank you, Ryan. And just as I was going through, and again, we'll try to continue to answer your questions. Another set of questions, as I glance through the open ones, does revolve around the area of town we talked about that was in the purple, the West Hills neighborhoods that are now, the committee moved them into the Finch area, which then fed into Glover and North Central. And historically, those families and students have been going south into Hutton and then Sacagawea and LC. So we can talk about that issue, the challenges around that. There's not one straight answer, but why don't we, I'd like to start with Craig. Craig, could you just talk about the enrollment issue? And that when we started the process, we started with the current boundaries. So that group was in the South, but as we tried to keep it in the South, the committee's process on that a little bit, and how the enrollment balance really challenged that.
Yeah, I mean, I think where we started, we started as a committee, we started with middle schools. And because we were opening 3 middle schools, we needed to redraw boundaries to be able to take advantage of the new capacity of the new middle schools and recognize that adding 6th graders to the current middle schools was not feasible. And we were going to have to adjust the boundaries of the existing middle schools. As we were reviewing and looking at where the overcapacity was, it came up through the committee to adjust and try to look for the spots where we could keep the students that were closest to each middle school to be able to go to their nearest middle school. And as we talked about early on in the presentation, and proximity and where our middle schools are in relation to where our population was, that wasn't always possible. But in relation to where we ended up with the River Run neighborhood, the West Hills area, we did see that as being it appeared to be the furthest away from the Sacagawea boundary that was going to have to get smaller regardless. All of the Mullen Road students have been moved out of the Sacagawea boundary into the new South Middle School, and there still wasn't going to be enough space. If we look at that whole area that is West Hills and Arboretum and Grandview and the Wilson students along the 195 corridor, when we started, that whole group was going to put Sacagawea at about 939, 940 students. Their ideal capacity is going to be in the range of 800 to 825. So we needed to find enrollment, or we needed to find options for about 140 students. We really struggled with, and I mean, we started with the near ones, as we talked about, whether to split Jefferson or whether it came through the committee as a kind of a last minute, what about the students that are in the Arboretum and Grandview and 195 area instead of splitting Jefferson in half? And even still with moving those kids to New South, we still were over capacity at Sacagawea with, so we needed to find a place for the West Hills area, the Palisades and River Run area. And as we were looking at capacity of having now 6 middle schools in the north, there was additional capacity at those schools, and Glover seemed to be the best fit.
Thank you, Craig. And through the feedback process, we have received what we wanted was we have received feedback from different communities. And from the River Run community, we have received feedback and some requests for some alternative considerations on sort of would these scenarios work instead of the current scenario, to either keep boundaries similar to what they are or do some alternate options. And we have collected those. The committee will see all the data, and we are actually, for each part of the city where we're collecting feedback, or each theme across the city, such as equity, that we're collecting feedback, we're going to actually work, the committee's going to come back together. We're going to look at options that have been presented, and then if we can refine those and bring the committee those pros and cons. So please know that I see many comments about some of the options have been proposed, and that's correct. The committee hasn't seen them yet. They have a meeting coming up after the last forum this week, where we'll bring options for different parts of the city that have come from the community or from committee members, as they've actually had time to sit and work through this with their with their community. So know that those are coming to the committee, and we will take a look at those, and the committee will interact with those. So I have a question. One of the questions we have here is, are there other scenarios that have been hidden from the public, and we're not showing them? This is really, so what we did is we worked in pieces around the district. So the scenarios were not complete scenarios. We would work either at one level, just elementary, for example, or we would work at just one area. And then of course, as we move across, then we're like, okay, we got to go back to that area because now that we've made changes here. And so there aren't any other full, like, oh, here's an alternate that the committee thought, well, let's just show this one, not that one. This was the culmination of all that work as we refined it to bring it out to the community. So you're seeing the summation of the work in a sense from the pieced work, if that's helpful. Megan, would you feel, I know I'm throwing this at you, but would you feel comfortable just speaking to that process a little bit about how we started in middle schools and went around this in then elementaries and high schools and then the whole thing?
Sure. So I think everyone on the committee would echo that it's a incredibly complex and sort of mind-blowing process. You think you're just looking at it and, oh, it'll be easy to draw some boundaries, but every time you look at moving one thing, it affects, 10 other things. So as we started looking at it, we took the lens of all of the guidelines that were discussed earlier. And we also took the lens of, we haven't done this in 40 years. So let's look at the map and let's look at how we can make some boundaries that make sense for the long term and keep neighborhoods together as much as we can. Look through each of those guidelines, decrease transportation where we can, keep neighborhoods together, keep cohorts together. And also to make sure that we don't end up with schools that are over capacity and or that have kids across the street that can't attend the school because it's over capacity. So once we did that, we went through a process and we kind of went neighborhood by neighborhood throughout the city. And we broke into small groups and looked at, if we move this boundary a little this way, how will it affect the numbers, the capacity at the school? How will it affect free and reduced lunch? How will it affect a variety of other metrics? And then when we got something we liked, okay, what did that do to these other 5 areas? And sometimes we had to go back and adjust those. So the process to get to where we are now was an iteration of all of those different things. So like Phil said, we may have had other scenarios with schools in different buckets or neighborhoods in different buckets, but not all together at the same time. Hopefully that.
Yeah, thanks, Megan.
It was complex enough that my explanation was probably a little too complex too.
No, that's all right. Thank you. There's a question, a few questions around legacy about, if we have a rising 5th grader that gets to stay, and we'll use an example. If you're in River Run and your rising 5th grader gets to stay at Hutton, but you have a 2nd grader at Hutton also, what happens? Because now you would have a 2nd grader at Finch under this proposal and a 5th grader at Hutton. And that is correct. The legacy program is in place to give parents an additional level of choice. If you choose to keep your child at Hutton, you can. If you prefer to have both of your students at the same school, you can. You don't have to keep your student at Hutton. And then if you want, then the choice scenario sits below that. And the choice scenario allows you, if you would like to see if you can have both students at Hutton where the legacy student is, you could try to choice the 2nd grader. And now that's going to be dependent upon capacity. Again, one benefit of the rebounding is that the capacity of the enrollment at all the schools will be rebalanced. So you won't have massively oversubscribed schools or massively undersubscribed, underutilized schools right off the bat. And so the one piece of that also is that there are places in the city where neighborhood kids cannot get into their neighborhood school because it's already full. And so this resetting in a sense will ensure that every student can get into their neighborhood school. And that's really important. And then ongoing, the district will monitor capacity at those schools to ensure that out of balance situation doesn't happen again, that would keep a neighborhood student from being able to attend their neighborhood school with their peers. Teresa, we had some questions coming on around how does diversity and equity factor in to these questions, and I know that LC, in the model, LC's free and reduced lunch numbers actually go down a little bit because of the cohort. Can you just sort of speak to how, as educators, and as the committee, we worked with that issue?
We did want to try to balance free reduced lunches across the district as much as we possibly could. It just, as that one model with Craig that Craig showed, the slices, it just wasn't going to work. And I give Craig all the credit for trying to come up with that crazy model. For us at LC, our free reduced rate will go down a bit. The consequence of that is less funding will come to Lewis and Clark now. With free reduced lunch students, there are extra funds available, title funds, LAP funds, and they travel with the child to the schools that they're at. And so schools with the higher free reduced lunch rate will get more funding to do more after school programs, smaller class sizes, more intensive programs to help students increase academic achievement. So we did try to balance that as best as we could. It just wasn't possible to do it perfectly. But we feel that how we've landed with our students that will lose at Lewis and Clark that will go to North Central now, there will be more funds available for them to support them even more than we've ever been able to. And so they will get all the services they need and help them out. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I appreciate that. Thanks for running that. I'm just looking to see if we have any other themes that we could. There is a series of questions around North and South, the denotations of North and South, and the committee. That was an organizational schema the committee used to operate as we moved around the city. There's a South Hill as a geographic place, but no schools were labeled North, and therefore they have to go North, or South, therefore they have to go South. We had multiple options and models that the committee worked with that spanned the freeway, spanned the river, especially in the west area, in the River Run area, as well as in the east area. And even actually in the central area, we looked at a few models trying to pull students down or send students up that would better align, keep them together, but send them through those feeder patterns. And so what you're seeing in the proposal is the one the committee felt kind of worked the best. I also do have a couple other, there were some questions about on the southeast side, do we have to split Moran Prairie and Adams? And I think that was a pretty robust conversation in the committee, and I'm trying to think if there's a great person to answer that. Greg, I'm gonna actually ask you if you don't mind, because I think you were really helpful in some of those conversations on school size and capacity. And can you just talk a little bit about the options actually that might exist? That, do we have to split those elementaries, Adams and Moran Prairie, or are there other options?
Well, when we look at the capacity of Case, the South, and Sacagawea as we build these schools out, our goals were to keep them in the 800s, the low 800s, because that's really what has been found through research, that it's the best size for a middle school, or optimum size. And as we looked at Adams and we looked at Moran Prairie, there were some ways that we could pull them completely, but at that point, we lost a little bit of the proximity to each middle school, to those individual middle schools. And that was a difficult question for the community, for the group to look through. And we really settled a little bit on the fact that we wanted to assess each area individually and as a whole. And that was where the committee ended up, not overburdening a middle school to keep a cohort together.
Correct. That said, I think, Ryan, I'm going to ask you, we do have some alternative models that I think we'll probably bring back to the committee that they've actually seen before, but we'll bring them back up in light of feedback to let them see again models that don't split an elementary, either Adams or Moran Prairie. Is that correct?
Yes, all the feedback we've been receiving from the community has been extremely helpful, and yes, we will be absolutely taking this feedback, compiling it, and seeing where we can take that feedback back to the committee with real scenarios that they can consider, and see if we can find out the best solution for families and for the district.
Terrific. Thank you. It looks like we have quite a few questions that have come in the last 10 minutes. So we're not going to be able to get to, we've answered about half, just a little over half. So if your question hasn't been answered, we will diligently go through and prepare an answer, and it will be sent out to you. It might take us a day or two to get caught up on that, but we will be committed to doing that. Mark, do you want to walk us through next steps?
Thank you, Phil. So next steps, we have one more forum scheduled for next Monday, and then our committee starts meeting again next week, getting all the feedback that we've had. Our committee members will study those. We'll work for a month making adjustments that we think are appropriate, and then share those adjustments with the school board. We had a work session before we started these forums with the board, and now we'll have a work session after the committee has done more work. And then the board will start holding their own hearings. There'll be a public hearing scheduled for June 2nd. Then on June 16th, kind of like we do board policies, there'll be another hearing where the board will hear more input. They may ask the committee to make some adjustments, but finally, we hope by June 23rd, they will approve the new boundaries for both elementary, middle, and high. As I mentioned at the beginning, then, that's a full year before we implement the boundary adjustments, first for the north side, because that's when the two new middle schools will open up on the north side, and then 2 years from the time that we'll open the new South Middle School and adjust the boundaries on the south side of the district. We will also be communicating regularly as we get close to those boundary changes, again, about parents' options for the legacy options that they can choose for their students, for the choice options that we'll continue to run. We'll do a lot of good communication on what options are for families to have to meet their particular family's needs. So plenty of time to have good communication and processing and looking at our school sizes, etc. So I want to thank everyone for attending tonight. As Phil said, we will get answers to your questions or comments. They'll all go to the committee. That's the purpose of these forums, is to give the committee, who, as Megan said, has been working on this complex issues. Kathleen and Kate have been working all alongside us on these issues, along with about 65 committee members working on these adjustments. So thank you for this evening, and stay tuned. If you would like to come back to another forum on the south side, it'll be next Monday night, same place, 6:30, same station. You can register for that online. So with that, thanks everyone, and have a good evening.